All right. Well, I had found Lob through Facebook that you had friended me. In fact, you were one of the people that friended me, but did not send any kind of message. So I just let the message sit there. Like, I don't know who this person is. So if people friend me, just mention the pot, say something. But I eventually looked at your page and saw that you were a philosophy guy. It's okay. All right. He's not a stalker or something.
Maybe I'm a philosophical stalker. I'm the new breed.
And I was glad that I did, because then I saw that you had a bunch of posts on Cornel West,
Right.
and that's what made me ask you about this. We came up with the idea of doing this after we did the feminism one last fall,
Right,
and
right.
thought, we should see what there is in race. And so finding somebody who knew something about it, and also, to be frank, a bunch of white guys talking about this, there's something that lacks legitimacy there.
I'm now beginning to feel like the token black philosopher, but
No.
I'll do that. I'll be that guy. That's what I've been in every department.
I said
that's fine. I'll
that
be
you are
that guy.
actually qualified and you teach this, that not that, I know a black guy. That is not the issue.
Yeah, because your best friend's black. Your best friend is black. So absolutely.
Well, I have to say this, guys. I come to the podcast directly from work, where I was talking to one of my colleagues who was African American. I was telling him about the podcast, and he said, "And the makeup of the guys who do the podcast, what is that exactly?" And I was like, I know. We're 4 white guys. That's it was the first thing that came to his mind when he asked whether I was legitimate that I would have a conversation about this topic. So It's definitely out there.
Yes, there's sort of a meta issue. Like, are we even allowed to talk about this? Like, you don't understand our oppression, so you should not be having a discussion about this at all. Or even when I was trying to phrase, I was sending out an email to you guys about a summary of the topic, and it seemed hard to even put it in words that could not possibly be interpreted as somehow racist. Like, if you say there's the problem of race, well, what's the problem with my race? What? So that even just defining the question.
Yeah, to me, it's a strange idea that because you're white, you can't talk about race. I mean, that's to make me sound like the conservative. Usually I'm labeled as the knee-jerk liberal, but I think that's strange. It'd be like saying, suppose you were studying the Industrial Revolution and someone said to you, you can't talk about that. It doesn't make any sense.
Because you're a farmer.
No, because you didn't live during that time and you didn't experience it. Well, that's not really to have a conversation about something doesn't necessitate
Having lived that experience.
Living that experience.
Absolutely.
And then part of the point of having a conversation is to have conversations about things that you haven't directly experienced, right?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of deep philosophical issue there about how we can get access to each other's experience, right? I mean, if you wholly identify your experience as being uncommunicable in a fundamental way, then that becomes a problem for having conversations. So it seems like we ought to be able to have conversations about all of these things because that's what conversation's about. And so there's got to be a way to give access to each other about it.
Yeah, I think it's a very pernicious idea, the idea that there are some classes of human beings with whom we can't identify.
No, I agree.
Somewhere in here, I was going to bring up the South Park episode that I was describing to Seth at some point, which was, there's a whole plot in it about this guy's trying to show his black friend that he understands, I understand what you're going through. I understand what you're sensitive about. And the guy's like, no, you don't get it. And finally, the guy gives up and says, I don't get it. And so his black friend says, now you get it. Like, that was the whole thing. The white guy, people just need to recognize that they don't get it, that there's a realm closed off to them. And that's as far as they can go.
That's the reason why I think so many people who deal with philosophy of race, and maybe not even directly, but just people who are trying to give people access to that experience, they do it through literature. They do it through a way wherein you can look through the eye. So I'm thinking of Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, which I would argue is an existential text. You read this text and you begin to see that this guy who is nameless, his experience is unique to his invisibility. And so you begin to realize, okay, this is what it feels like to be invisible. This is what it feels like to have no name. This is what it feels like to live this experience wherein you are, on the one hand, an American, but at the same time, you're an African American. And you feel this tension within yourself that W.E.B. Dubois calls double consciousness. And so I think part of the reason why so many people, Richard Wright with Native Son, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, why so many times instead of tackling the subject matter directly through philosophy or through theory, they instead take you on a journey, if you will, so that you can see what it feels like, as opposed to looking at it from the outside and trying to imagine what that feels like.
That presentation, that sort of brings up the question for me. studying civil rights, studying this stuff is great for a humanities education, certainly. Like, it really sucked to live back in slave times. Or reading Richard Wright, it sucked to live in a time where prejudice was rampant. And you can even look at different situations now. So from a humanities perspective, sure.
Right.
But then the question is like, well, how is that philosophical?
Absolutely.
Where does the philosophy come in? I've sort of compared this to learning about the Holocaust. Like, if you've never seen a bunch of Holocaust movies or something, like, you're missing part of the liberal education. You're missing some of what you need to be human, to realize that that kind of bad stuff happens. But to go further and like actually draw something philosophical from that is separate.
That's a valid question, but I think there's a great deal. I was listening to a lecture from Charles W. Mills, who's up in Northwestern. He was once at OU, and so I met him, and he was really influential in me going into philosophy. And he was talking about, well, why is race something that is philosophically interesting? One of the things that he pointed out was that when you look at foundational texts for philosophy, one of the things that comes up is, of course, the Republic. And one of the major questions within the Republic is the question of justice. Now, when you take that question of justice and you begin to examine all of the implications of wherein justice is relevant, then you begin to see areas where racial justice is important. And you begin to see that perhaps when it comes to racial justice, you begin to realize that, particularly in after modernity, racial justice affected the majority of the world population. And then even further, very real crimes resulted because of racial issues as relates to justice. And so it requires of us to take a step back and to examine, well, where do these ideas about race come from? Where do they come from the culture? Where do they come from science? Also within the realms of theology. Where do we get these ideas of race? And then from there, well, what are the implications of these ideas once we know kind of where they come from? And so those were some of the issues that he was dealing with. But, these are questions that feminism were forced to deal with. Why should we be concerned about feminism? Why should we be concerned about gay issues? Every new discipline always has this level of tension of, should we get involved in this? Is this philosophical enough? Is it or is it not? And so George Yancey would say something along the lines of, well, every time you look at philosophy, you have these people who are kind of gatekeepers who will say that is not philosophical. Right. And they uphold what he says is the norms of philosophy. And it requires people to really push through these norms and say, no, we are relevant. What we have to say is significant. And so you must examine us. And then I think that existentialism really provides even more fodder for the fire, wherein existentialism really deals with some of these issues of what does it mean to be black? What does it mean? Who is black? Is Barack Obama black, right? Those real genuine questions, of existential origin, I think kind of relate to this. So it's a lot of stuff. It's not clearly defined yet, I wouldn't say, but it's getting there. We just need more work behind it, I would say.
Yeah, speaking of the existentialism, I know one of the readings that you had first come up with for a potential thing to do for this was some Frantz Fanon, who is a French existentialist who is a psychoanalyst, and he read a lot of Sartre. To some extent, all breeds of existentialism are just these overdramatic, technical language-laced descriptions of experience. And so I thought that was, you stare at me and the blackness is tattooed upon my skin, and you see my ontology, my essence is before my existence because you consider me just the essence of blackness and you don't see myself, so it does give a very vivid way of putting it.
You just used the name Frantz Fanon. Is that name dropping?
I will follow up on it. All right.
It is technically,
especially since it wasn't on our reading list, Mark.
I think George Yancey might have been a name drop there.
Oh, man, you got me.
These will all, hey, I've been alerted to the fact that a lot of listeners don't look at the blog, which is ridiculous. Because all these things will be, I'll have a post on each of these guys in the blog. I have a big stack of books I got out this time, and I want to at least give a 2-line review or something of them.
Okay, cool.
I'm trying to get posts up announcing the topics before we actually do the discussions now.
Right.
So that people have a chance to sort of have input. I'm always hopeful that people have sort of provocative questions that we can maybe incorporate. And there's a little bit of that, but more it was like, did you look at these 12 other sources?
Yeah.
The discussion's in 2 days. No.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I did want to address that real quickly because I saw a lot of people were like, yo, you should really do this or you should really do that. The reason why I think it's important for us to do these particular texts is because these kind of serve the foundation for all of the other stuff that comes later on. And so it's very important for us to deal with the foundation. So, for example, when you look at W.E.B. Du Bois, his Of Our Spiritual Strivings came from 1905. And so that really lays the foundation for much of what happens later on for Black existentialism. So these are really the foundational texts. I mean, we could deal with a lot of different guys who are writing now and gals who are writing now, bell hooks and George Yancey and Frank. We could deal with a lot of different stuff. But I think it's important to kind of deal with the foundational text that everyone kind of goes back to and says, okay, this is central to the development of some kind of philosophy of race. That's the reason why I picked these.
Yeah, and these are...
Yeah. No, I was excited about the Dubois. I'd never had to read him before. Maybe part of it, I watched a series of lectures, which I will post to, from Stanford on this he's one of the guys who edited MLK's papers.
Okay, right.
And he really talked up Dubois as being like the preeminent intellectual of his time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wonderful writer.
Yeah.
He was a phenomenal guy. He was the first Black guy to graduate from Harvard. But here's an interesting story. One day, Dubois goes into William James and says, William James, I want to major in philosophy. William James says to him, no, there is no room for Black people within this discipline. You should major in something that has a little bit more practical implications. And so he decides to go into a different realm. So he was initially interested in philosophy. That's the reason why a lot of his writings have this philosophical feel to them. He was initially interested in philosophy, but William James told him not to major in it.
Man.
I had not read that little bit. I read that he took classes with him and with Santayana.
Right.
And so he's definitely plugged into this history that we're already covering.
We still read Du Bois at St. John's, right?
Yep. Du Bois is in the senior year.
Good.
And I saw most of that book, The Souls of Black Folk, is history. I mean, Du Bois is a history guy. And it's sort of history and cultural commentary. Like, here's what it was like to teach at an all-Black small schoolhouse in the rural South when he did that. Right. And here's how crummy it is for Blacks now working in the cotton mills and living in conditions that are very similar to what they lived in slavery times, but they're sort of used to that, and that's how things are set up. And that's his area of expertise. Is he wrote a very famous book on the Reconstruction post-Civil War.
Right. He was a history major. One of the things that he did that was significant was, of course, I think the major philosophical contribution from Du Bois would definitely be this idea of double consciousness. I think without a doubt that is the major philosophical contribution, because what he begins to examine is the power of white stereotypes on Black life and thought. And so you have a really cool movie by Spike Lee called School Days. Anyway, there's this musical selection in School Days entitled Good and Bad Hair, where
yes, there is.
It's absolutely, it's phenomenal. Anybody who's not seen that, you need to stop what you're doing, pause this, and go watch this, and then come back and listen to the rest of us. But honestly, it's a phenomenal little litany. And Chris Rock did this documentary about good and bad hair also. Where do we get these ideas of good hair? Well, good hair comes from the white standards of hair. Right. And so Du Bois is very concerned about Black people being told that we have the wrong lips, the wrong hips, the wrong skin pigmentation, the wrong texture of hair. And he's very concerned about the power that these stereotypes hold over the Black psyche. And so you'll see very frequently, a preoccupation in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s with light skin, and these are all an internalization of white standards of beauty that Black people now hold up against one another. And Du Bois is very concerned about this. And so he comes up with this idea of double consciousness to articulate what he sees happening here. And so that begins the discussion, I guess, over the years about Black existentialism and what does it feel to be Black, and where do we get these ideas of what's good and what's bad, particularly within the Black experience. And Du Bois wants to say that it comes from this double consciousness.
I have a quote here I can read about his double consciousness. This is about 3 paragraphs into the essay. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks in on amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
Oh, absolutely.
So as I was reading through this, I was trying to figure out both what he meant by double consciousness, but also balance that with the way he talks about it even here. It's an existential condition But he talks of it as being a kind of affliction rather than something, for lack of a better term, that's bad and oppressive, something to be overcome, essentially.
Absolutely.
And West, we'll talk about West in a little bit, I imagine, but West goes along a very similar route and picking the aesthetic issues as one branch of his genealogy and the rational issues, the classification issues as the other branch of his genealogy as a way of articulating this double consciousness. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I wondered about was just the way in which this double consciousness is also an affliction and how that figures into the existentialist claim about it.
I don't think it's just the fact of a double consciousness that's necessarily an affliction, right? Because we all make all sorts of different identifications at different levels.
Right.
I'm an American, I'm a this, I'm a that.
Right.
And it's really about the extent to which there's conflict between those things. And if my identity as an American is in conflict with my racial identity, not even just in conflict, but if the history of my country and the culture involves the degradation of my race, then I think that that's definitely a kind of affliction. So I don't know if the goal is, because I was looking at the end of the essay and trying to figure out exactly what the goal is,
right.
But I don't know if it's necessarily to get rid of the double consciousness. It's to develop this sort of harmony between those different identifications, let's say.
Yeah, I would agree.
Really? Develop a harmony?
Well, look at page 14, let's say, because that's where he's talked about the different ideals, physical freedom, political power, education, all those things.
Well, I had a quote. It's just at the third to the last paragraph at the end. He says, work, culture, liberty, all these we need, not singly, but together, not successively, but together, each growing and aiding each. And he goes on at the end, he says, in order that someday on American soil, two world races may give each other to each those characteristics both so sadly lacks.
Yeah.
I mean, in that statement is a kind of notion that maybe not harmony, but certainly not exactly integration.
Well, let me read another quote as well,
Okay.
just to supplement that on page 13. The ideal of fostering and developing the traits and talents of the Negro, not in opposition to or in contempt for other races, but rather in large conformity to the greater ideals of the American Republic, in order that someday on an American soil... Okay, did you just read that same quote?
Yeah.
Except I started a little earlier, sorry.
It was on a different page than yours, Wes, apparently, but...
Yeah, so I'm thinking of this conformity to the greater ideals of the American Republic.
Did anybody else, when they were reading that, hear like the echoes of Hegel talking about this construction of consciousness through the eyes of others?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what echoed to me.
So we all have selves that are built in this way. The difference is that for him, the people who define his identity hate him, or hate his race. Whereas in a healthier situation, so that's a lot of what the Frantz Fanon, the psychotherapist, is describing with pathology. He was in Northern Africa, but had been a place that was colonized by the French and thought that the Black Sea was dealing with, and including himself, had serious sort of inferiority complex because what culture meant in his time was white culture. Mm-hmm. And so it's just this self-loathing. You don't build an appropriate sense of self. So you end up seeing, like in Cornel West, he has a whole books of practical recommendations to the Black community of how to improve their lot. And a lot of it comes down to this building self-esteem, getting rid of these things that, I don't know, two privileged white kids when I was growing up. And now we're going to have a rally about self-esteem. Like, really? And this is ridiculous. And maybe it is just kind of ridiculous to legislate it, but there's a reason for it. And in some communities, certainly if the society or the history of the society has been beating you down and giving you this negative self-image from when you start, then it's certainly something that's sadly needed.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Because, one of the things that Cornel West says in Race Matters, and I believe he says it in the very first chapter of that book, Nihilism in the Black Community. One of the things he says is that, on the one hand, we have to fight racism that is external to us. We have to fight these institutions that try to subjugate us. But on the other hand, we have to, what he says in another place, rehabilitate the Black psyche. Or in other words, to teach Black people or to teach the Black community that you are not inferior, that you are not inherently ugly. And so Cornel West, he sees the importance on both sides, both fighting racism that is external to the Black community, but also fighting the racism that we have internalized.
Yeah, and it's a precarious kind of fight, right? And that sort of gets at
absolutely
Martin Luther King's approach and also the Seth's mention of Hegel in the same way that if someone were to say, well, why make that identification with a culture that hates you? Or why not make the fight about ridding yourself of that identification? But there's really not a choice because you really, in the end, can't give up your Americanness let's say.
Many have tried. Oh my, many have absolutely tried. And you're getting right to the heart of it, because that gives rise to nationalism on the one hand with Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And then this idea of what I'll call integrationism. I'm not sure that they would like that, but integrationism with Martin Luther King Jr. and those kinds of guys, because you have this problem. What do? We are Africans who are in America. Okay. What do we do now? Well, on the one hand, you can say, well, let's go the Marcus Garvey route. Man, I'm dropping all kinds of names. I'm sorry. You can go the Marcus Garvey route and get on a ship and go back to Africa and try to do that at least. Or you can go the Martin Luther King route and try to integrate with what Black nationalists see as their enemy. And so you have this tension where, what do we do now? How should you respond whenever violence is inflicted upon you? Should you be nonviolent, or should you have self-defense? All these issues begin to come up.
Well, let's say a little bit about what is philosophical about it, maybe a little bit in contradistinction to what is political about it. I know that might be a kind of ham-fisted distinction.
No, I think that's a fair.
But, part of it, thinking about the question of Hegel, or even thinking about questions of identity and authenticity,
right,
which seem to resonate more directly philosophically. And there may be lots of practical concerns about how to render any of those issues in the real world. But I think both Dubois and West are making claims, especially West, about the philosophical underpinnings of questions of identity and authenticity.
Right.
And I'd like to sort of push into that a little bit. One of the ways of the reactions that you presented, going with Garvey or going with King or going with Malcolm X, have to do with reactions to questions of resolving identity and living authentically in a world that doesn't embrace you on the average, that kind of thing. And those resonate in lots of different ways. You might choose to be part of a cloistered community. You might choose to be raging against the community, that kind of thing.
Right.
Seth, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you were thinking of Hegel's.
What tipped me was just when Wes talked about reconciliation. It seemed to me that what he was pointing at was the need to, I don't want to say dialectically transcend, but kind of along the lines of what Mark was saying, is that we all go through this process in developing the self-identity. There's just something particular to the experience that he was describing, where he was trying to say we have to kind of push through, because even in the Hegelian model, the dialectic between self and other is one of struggle. And so even Hegel's power structure, the metaphor that Hegel uses in the Lord and Bondsman is one of servitude. And so the metaphor itself is kind of apt. But I thought what Du Bois was pointing at was that there seems to be something maybe even more extreme or more intense, or somehow different in quality, maybe not different in kind, relative to just the general struggle that Hegel's describing in the Phenomenology of Spirit.
And critically with that struggle, you can't just kill off or cast off the other, because your existence is tied to the other.
Right.
So that's not a way out. And that's where I think, you get the contrast between the Malcolm X approach or the Martin Luther King approach. I think Martin Luther King recognized that a simple wholesale rejection of one part of the double consciousness wasn't going to work.
It's very difficult when you feel the, if I can use these terms, when you feel the thesis and antithesis, right? When you feel those at war with one another and you feel it within yourselves, how do you reach that synthesis? How do you get there? And I think that's some of the issues that they're kind of dealing with. How do you do that? How do you get there?
Now, I know as soon as we posted this topic, actually, I think I put it in terms of race and power or something. I didn't mention the African-American struggle in particular. And somebody responded like, talk about race in general. What are the other races? And when you try to come up with a general concept of race, then things get very difficult, which is why I just decided, let's not do that at all. But there's something to be said. And Du Bois is thinking about this. I sent you guys a link to an essay by Anthony Appia called The Uncompleted Argument, Du Bois and the Illusion of Race. So Du Bois is recommending that you somehow embrace blackness, that there's a peculiarly black character in America that has something to contribute to the culture. It shouldn't just be squashed in terms of whiteness, but at the same time, there's an ambition. There's something about white America that black folks have to learn as well. So that's where the cultural combination is going to come through. But he had a long career, and some of the time had this very Pan-African sentiment. And that brings the question, what is the thing exactly? You could say we've got this shared history of oppression.
Right.
And certainly for his time, absolutely. There was nobody that was alive. This is like when slavery was like in the memory of living people and things. Like there is just no question that everybody in that country had this shared background. I mean, 100 years later or something, it's much more questionable. But even at the time, there was the question then, well, is the thing that he's recommending, the soulfulness, the spiritual strivings that he's depicting that is supposed to enrich the American spirit or something, if integrated into the culture, if the culture has to learn from it, is that something peculiarly just this African-American experience, or is it something having to do with a race, which means something more than just this group of people who are here at this particular time with these experiences? And this essay by Appia sort of said that Du Bois really didn't have a good answer for that. He wanted to define it culturally, right? This is because of a shared experience. But I mean, if you think about, well, how do you determine that a people have had a shared experience? You have to determine already the identity of that people over time. And when it came to that, Du Bois just referred to skin color. And that's why he could be in favor of this Pan-Africanism. And because Africa, too, it also had this colonial history. So, there's a lot of even just culturally. But beyond that, and so this is where it comes to today, that maybe some people with black skin today do not necessarily identify with any particular shared experience. They might have been raised in a perfectly affluent, been completely divorced even from the relatively recent civil rights issues, let alone anything else. So that's where all these... Is Obama really black because he was born in Hawaii? His father was just straight from Africa. There's, no ties to sort of the African-American experience at all. Right. Do we have to even care about defining the term race? In some ways, that seems like kind of a pedantic philosopher bullshit thing.
I did read that essay, and I was sort of glad that we were avoiding, for the most part, the whole question of, is there such a thing as race? Because I think to the extent that you're a skeptic about race, you're a skeptic about species, or you're a skeptic about any sort of classification. The skepticism rests on this claim that there aren't any Aristotelian essences and there aren't any hard and fast distinctions that allow us to say that there is this firm ontological category race. But we can do that with lions and tigers, and we can even do that further with chairs and tables. Mm-hmm. But for all practical purposes, there are lions and tigers and chairs and tables, and there are distinct races. I think the more important question of whether or not there is some ontological level, whether a metaphysical level really races, is that there's a distinction between certain physiological characteristics like skin color and hair, let's say, and then cultural distinctions. And that when we talk about race, often we're talking about both things, and we're using the physical characteristics as a marker for cultural characteristics. And then, of course, cultures aren't hard and fast either. They merge at the boundaries and they share lots of things. So it becomes a very complex question. But I think the important part there is that when we talk about race, we're often talking about two things. We're talking about culture and then physical characteristics.
I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I'm seeing a lot of literature that's just digging into this question of, is there really a valid biological category called race? And I don't think that's the issue at all. I don't think that's even remotely important necessarily. We are where we are. How do we make sense of where we are now, as opposed to taking a step back and asking these biological questions? I think you're absolutely right.
I think West would probably agree with that, but West in his Genealogy makes a spirited argument that this category of race is a product of the scientific revolution.
Mm-hmm. He would say that. You're right.
And that it's a fundamentally Cartesian act, and that it may be that we revise that part of the scientific revolution, but that it is a category of its own that comes out of the classification activity of modern science, period. And it's that activity and the sort of obsession with species or obsessions with kinds, which, I think in the end, there's a long story to be told about that metaphysical disposition in Descartes.
Does he
West or does he Descartes?
West. It's clear that he says white supremacy is a product, or what does he call it, secretion?
I think he says secretion, yeah.
Of these factors. But whether the category of race is... Because on page 55, he does relate the category of race to racism.
Right.
So he says on page 55, near the bottom, the genealogy of racism in the modern West is inseparable from the appearance of the classificatory category of race in natural history. But I don't know that means he's outright questioning race is a real thing. It's unclear to me from this essay.
Whether he's questioning race as a real thing or whether he's attributing race as a real thing.
I don't think that from this essay I see that he's a skeptic about race. He may be.
It's not clear to me what his position from the essay is about the category of race, because he's self-consciously doing this genealogy. Right. I think it's pretty clear that from his perspective, one of the two prongs of the generation of racism is the development of the category of race that he puts wholly in the camp of the activity of modern science.
Right. But one thing that I think that West completely misses, and I think it's a very important point, is that he does not deal with the roots of race in the Bible. Did you guys notice that? He completely disregards it. Because when you look at, and I hope I'm right, Genesis 9, verses 18 through 20, somewhere in there, you see Noah after the flood, Noah and the ark, Side note, that ark had to be funky. Side note. All right, keep on going. Anyway, so when you look at Noah in the ark, he gets out of the ark and he gets drunk. And one of his sons sees him naked and goes back and tells the brothers. Anyway, he ends up cursing this son. And as a result of that, he says to him, your descendants are going to be slaves. Well, the son that he curses ends up being, according to the biblical narrative, the father of black people. And so a great number of people who are religiously devout look at this text and other places in the Bible, like Ephesians, where it talks about slavery, look at these texts as saying, well, slavery is okay. Racism's okay. That's just, a God-ordained fact of life. It's regrettable, but that's just the way that it is. That's how a lot of slave owners justified having slaves and treating their slaves the way that they did, because the Bible said it was all right, according to their interpretation of it. And so West just never brings it up in this text. And well,
he makes a cursory mention of it.
Does he?
But I think your general point is right, but he sort of gives a little cursory mention on page 54.
Okay, I see it.
Of course, biblically based accounts of racial inferiority flourished, but the authority of the church prohibited the proliferation of non-religious, that is, proto-modern accounts of racial inferiority.
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't really deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah, your essential point, though, and this is what struck me, is that he's quick to say, well, yes, there are biblically based accounts of racial inferiority, but he's not going to sort of ground his genesis in that. But it's unclear to me that he can really ground the genesis in the two strands that he does, art and science.
Yeah, I agree.
The revival of class. They may have lent themselves to racism. It may have been that science was used for racist ends, but it's unclear to me that science was a necessary or a sufficient condition, let's say, of racism.
No, I agree.
Does somebody want to just summarize this reading, since we've now made the formal transition and you're already referring to details? Right? This is chapter 2 of Prophesied Deliverance,
right.
An Afro-American Revolutionary Christianity, which we don't have to care about ultimately what his project is in terms of that, but at this part, he's just giving this historical overview of why he thinks racism is endemic in modern Western culture.
Well, it's historical, but it's a genealogy self-consciously in the vein of Nietzsche or Foucault, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he breaks up this genealogy into two big prongs.
Right, two stages.
One being the advent of modern science, where he has essentially says modern science is the birth of formal classification, born out of Cartesian certainty, and then combines that with the aesthetics and art, which has folded into it the classical revival and Greek and Roman aesthetics that combine together to give the birth of white supremacy.
What did you guys make of, it's on page 53, the bottom of 53, and it goes over to 54, I'll read it for you. What do you make of his idea of the normative gaze? Because this features prominently in what he's going to say later. He says, what I shall call the normative gaze, namely, an ideal from which to order and compare observations. This ideal was drawn primarily from classical values of beauty, proportion, and human form, classical cultural standards of moderation, self-control, and harmony. What do you guys make of that normative gaze? I like the idea of it, to be honest with you. I think it's a fruitful idea. I'm not sure that he pulls off proving it, though. What do you guys think?
Well, I was reflecting that back to his, let me read another quote from page 48. Right. So this is right before he sort of goes into the details of the account. I shall argue that the initial structure of modern discourse in the West secretes the idea of white supremacy. I call this secretion, the underside of modern discourse, a particular logical consequence of the quest for truth and knowledge in the modern West. My argument is the authority of science undergirded by a modern philosophical discourse guided by Greek ocular metaphors and Cartesian notion promotes and encourages the activities of observing, comparing, and measuring and ordering physical characteristics of human bodies. Moving forward, these things, though efficacious in the quest for truth and knowledge, prohibited the intelligibility and legitimacy of the idea of black equality in beauty, culture, and intellectual capacity. In fact, to think such an idea was to be deemed irrational, barbaric, or mad. That's a strong statement. And that's what I had in mind when I was considering the normative gaze. I just couldn't get over this, almost caricaturing it in a postmodern way. We just had our Derrida, etc. episode as it is black equality. It was just literally unthinkable. Like there's no word for it. There was no norm for it. All language is based on this episteme that underlies the whole culture. And if that thing is messed up, then you can't even express a dissenting view, which I think is a little silly. I think there's sort of a Hegelian dialectic built into these things so that even if you have a normative gaze, if you have this standard.